It's also an option. So raise your hand. You don't have to raise your hand, but you get the idea. If you feel that perhaps sometimes you do things for your kids that they should really be doing for themselves. How did I know? And that's why I think this is such an important conversation, because I think we all know what we're supposed to do, and there's a big breakdown between what we know intellectually and what we actually do. So we know that we're supposed to, as the cliche goes, give them wings. But I'll give you an example. So, once upon a time I used to be able to keep these things anonymous, because I used to be able to say one of my kids and then you wouldn't know which one I'm talking about, but I've only got 2 kids living at home now, so it's either the one or the other. So our son last night he was at a thing, they were actually doing Hatzolah training, and I had to put Shayna to bed because Nomi's not here. So the plan was that there was somebody who was supposed to give him a lift home. And then the plan didn't work. And it was all of 8:15 p.m., which may as well be the witching hour. And he needed to get home. So I'd like to know, what would you do? He's a young teen. What would you do?
How old is he?
At that age, he's 14. So what would you do? 8 o'clock at night, and he's on the other side of town in the deep, dark Glen Hazel, and he's got to get home at 8 p.m. Let's just call it round numbers at night. So what do you do?
Did one of his
I don't
friends'
know.
parents?
I don't know if you
give him
Uber
a-
at that age.
Okay, so here's the question, right? Do you Uber or don't you Uber?
No, I wouldn't Uber.
That's really the question. Do you Uber or do you not Uber? That is the question,
California had it here with us.
right?
That was my daughter at the wedding last night when we were ready to leave. She said, "Please, mommy, I'll stay at Uber home."
Uber home, yeah.
You mad?
Okay.
But I don't know what the boy, if it's different.
No.
So it was I felt like it was a watershed moment, because, there were various ways to play this, and none of his friends live on this side of town. So there were no parents coming even remotely in this direction. And he was extremely uneasy about getting into an Uber. And that's what convinced me to Uber him. was the fact that he was uneasy about it. In other words, this was the thought process. Thought process was, first of all, we definitely in this country are overprotective of our children. And I'm not suggesting that we should be negligent, but there is a fine line between allowing people to assert their independence and mollycoddling them. And where I really noticed this for the first time is with one of our other kids. Now I could say one of our other kids because there are a number to choose from, who is currently overseas. And I'm finding that there's so much that we would take for granted in terms of how you navigate life, whether it's public transport, whether it is looking after your laundry, whatever the case is. And I'm looking and thinking, wow, I don't know if I prepared you properly for this. I think we were a little bit too overprotective. So every single decision, obviously, is an independent decision. You can't necessarily make a rule from one to the other. But in this particular case, I thought, to be perfectly honest, he's going to be coming along the route of the G20. There are more cops on that route than we have ever seen in this country. Literally. And it is an app where you can track the person's movements. So I told them, listen, you share the ride with me, and I'll keep an eye on it. And, I think actually Uber is a respectable company that 99.9% of the time has a reputation to uphold, either as a company or as individual drivers. And yes, I've also heard those stories, as we all have. But there comes a time where I think you've got to be practical. The kid had to get home. and so I hope that this is like a breakthrough moment for him. Now, maybe some of you feel quite judgmental about my decision, but my point is, it's difficult to know when to draw that line between independence and taking responsibility and rushing in to save our kids. And I think we spend a lot of time saving our kids. That's a very generic statement, and it's possibly an unfair statement, but I do think that we spend a lot of time saving our kids from various things. They didn't get their act together to do X and Y. Like, I have a policy, if you get to school and you've forgotten your lunch at home, then you've forgotten your lunch at home. That's like, I'm not running to school to deliver lunch or your sports uniform or whatever the case is, because at some point you've got to learn, you've got to take responsibility. But because it's a spectrum, and because all of us have different sentiment around these things, it's difficult to know what are the rules. Like, how do you work this thing out? How do you know that you're not damaging your child? Because I think that's the ultimate fear of every Jewish parent, that I'm going to do something that's going to damage my child, and then they'll be psychologically who knows what, and they'll spend the rest of their life in therapy speaking about their mother, which is probably inevitable anyway. So whatever you're going to do is probably going to have the same result regardless. But I really feel we overthink this. We overthink this. And if you have a look at other segments of our population over here, they don't overthink it to the same extent that we do. And they allow their children, maybe to the point of negligence, but they definitely allow their children a lot more leeway and freedom than what we do. I'm not suggesting you should tell your kid to catch a taxi home. That I'm not suggesting. But it's very, very important for us to try work this thing out. And it boils down essentially to three components. Maybe there's more, but the three components that I was thinking of: love, attachment, and independence. So you obviously love your children. Therefore, you are attached to them. And therefore, it is difficult to know how to balance independence. I think that's kind of like in a nutshell how it all works. And we don't want, and especially because we are in such tight-knit social circles where everybody's kind of looking over everybody's shoulder, and there's no judgment in our community, obviously. And, so we're afraid of what somebody's going to think, and maybe you don't love your child enough, etc., etc. So this is loaded. It's very loaded. But I think if we analyze these three things and we try and get a little bit of a sense of what they are and how they work, then hopefully we can get to a better place in terms of allowing our children to have those colloquial wings. So the way I want to do it today is just firstly put it out there and have a little bit of a conversation, just hear some high-level points of what you think around these things. And then we're going to talk about angels, not because we have to believe our children are angels, but because the story of angels is going to help us. And hopefully we'll walk out of here with some kind of template that we could use. So at a high level, how do you think our Jewish community is doing in terms of creating independent young people? Not good? No? So you can't comment.
Yeah.
Why are you so negative? Why do you say such a bad job? I'm not agreeing or disagreeing. I'm just curious. Want to unpack it better and understand it. Like, why do you think, not why do you think parents are doing what they're doing? We're going to get there. Why do you say that we're doing such a bad job? In other words, what are you seeing that illustrates that we're not doing a good job of giving our kids independence? Actually, the truth is you could Dafka chime in because you can compare.
I mean, I'll be honest, like when I went to Israel for my gap year, I got there, I literally did not know how to use a washing machine, a dryer, do anything, because the kids do grow up with housekeepers in this country who clean up after them, do everything. And like raising my children in California, even with a little bit of help, they know how to do their own laundry, they know how to go to the kitchen and cook, they obviously Uber there and whatever. It is very different raising kids there than here. I just think because it's of the lifestyle, it's just
100%. I'm going to go even a step further. So you went to Israel for your gap year and didn't know how to use a washing machine. I know some people who had their gap year 30 years ago and they still don't know how to use a washing machine. Right?
That's also circumstantial.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack that because
We just moved back.
so let's just talk about this, the circumstantial. I think it's a very, very important part of the conversation. How much can we blame on circumstance and how much do we actually have to take responsibility for? So let's. I think when you say circumstantial, you're going to talk about things like transport. That's probably one of the big things that's going to be circumstantial for us, because we don't have a public transport system that we would allow our children to use. Whether that's right or wrong is another whole conversation, but that's the fact. And so that circumstance forces us into a situation that we land up doing a lot of lifts and that kind of stuff. The circumstance of having household help is not necessarily a good enough reason for children not to own up and take responsibility. That's a choice that we make in a parenting style, where perhaps it's easy for us to say, well, we're going to do these things because we have help, or we can make a choice otherwise. So that's why I want to be clear about what we mean when we say circumstances.
I also think though circumstantially we mollycoddle our kids because of the sort of existential threat that we live under constantly in terms of crime. I mean, you can't take away from it. So we almost overcompensate in terms of trying to make sure our kids are so safe and sound all the time that we forget to actually give them the space to grow and be independent.
Okay, so I want to jump in on that point because it's such an interesting point. And I feel if we had this conversation 10 years ago, we would be able to identify that South Africa is so different to the rest of the world because of the crime situation, and therefore we want to protect our children. The research globally, I shouldn't say globally, in Western countries, the research illustrates that the same trends apply in most Western society setups for different reasons. So in other words, we're afraid of the fact that, God forbid, you walk the streets and something's going to happen to you in terms of you'll be held up. I mean, the truth is, if our kids were walking the streets, they'd probably have a lower chance of being held up than if they were driving with us in the car. I'm just saying statistically. But in many places in the developed world, people don't want their children to go out because why? Because there are predators out there. So the notion of children, the research shows that the notion of children going to play independently in the park globally is on the down, significantly on the down. I'll just give you another example of the same principle. So when you were a kid, you went to the park, yes? Yeah? You went to the park. What play equipment did they have in the park? Steel jungle gyms. Right? There was none of this padded flooring, whatever it is, this spongy flooring around all of the jungle gyms or whatever the case. So they were just jungle gyms, just like steel jungle gyms. And slides, and some of those slides were too tall. If you go to the really good parks, some of them were very high, and there was no protection. What else was there in a park? There were people, that's true. There was something called a merry-go-round. Okay? You will be hard-pressed to find a merry-go-round in a park in today's world because it's considered a dangerous ride. So in any developed country, they will not have merry-go-rounds in parks. And we'll go check. I mean, this is research. It's not something that's, just a thumbsuck. Because they're considered way too dangerous because somebody could go flying off the... What else did we have in parks? You've forgotten one of the main things that we have in parks. We still have them now. Trees. And kids used to climb them. And kids used to fall out of them. And sometimes they got hurt. And we all survived. Whereas in today's world, if a kid would climb a tree, there's a pretty good chance that the parent is going to jump in and say, whoa, don't do that. That's dangerous. Just think about that for a moment. In your own experience, have you ever seen your children climb a tree? Maybe you have, right? It's not that common. It's not like it used to be. Where are our kids spending the lion's share of their time? On gadgets. So that's a different form. We're not mollycoddling kids by allowing them to spend so much time on screens, but we are robbing them of independence by allowing them so much time on screens. So independent thought, independent play, creative, free play, using imagination, or whatever the case is. When I'm speaking over here about independence, I'm not just talking about the fact that you pick your kid up from school. That could be a great bonding session. There was a family here. They were representing one of the Israeli organizations, I forget which. And they were here for a number of years. And when they left, they had like a farewell kiddush at the shul that they attended. And at the kiddush, the father got up and he said, you know what I will miss most from living in this country? What was it? School lifts and dinners. He says, because I know when I go to Israel, I will no longer sit in the car with my children, and we will no longer eat supper together, because the nature of the lifestyle is different. So when I'm talking over here about independence or the lack of independence, I'm not just talking about the fact that we spend time doing things with or for our kids. It's beyond that. Are we nurturing children who have this robust sense of me, as opposed to just doing things without their parents? See the difference? So I can say, wow, my child is so independent because they don't bother me all day. That's not necessarily independent. That just means that they're hooked on something which is feeding them in some unhealthy way, so that they're not engaging the world. Now, I think I told some of you have heard this from me before, but I'm going to quote it again. First of all, I'm a big proponent of this book that you have to read called The Anxious Generation. You have to read it. So a lot of the research that I'm just sharing with you now comes from this book. And it's all about the damage that we're doing to our children by overprotecting them. It's an incredibly important book. So one of the examples that he cites in this book is that they did it, this is already, I think, in the 80s or possibly in the 90s. They did this experiment somewhere in the Arizona desert to create the kind of biosphere that they would need if they're going to make a colony on Mars. So seeing as that's obviously something really important for us, one day, there'll be a colony in Mars. So they did this, they created this biosphere just to test what would behave in what kind of way in a completely artificial environment. And one of the most intriguing things that they found was that there were trees, no matter what kind of tree it was, that when they got to a certain height, obviously relative to the particular tree, but every tree that they tried to grow there, when it got to a certain height, it broke and fell over. And they couldn't work out why this was. The same trees that we have throughout all of our neighborhoods, but somehow in this biosphere, when they grew, they cracked and they fell over. And after a lot of research, they came to the conclusion, well, they worked out that this is what happens. See, in its natural environment, a tree is exposed. Like right now, there's a storm outside. That means that the trees are not protected as we are sitting inside a room. The trees are exposed to the storm. And what that means is that there's a lot of pressure on the tree. There's the wind buffeting the tree. There's the rain torrentially pouring down on the tree. And what they discovered is that particularly from wind, the nature of the molecules of the tree's bark is that they would bind together when they had that buffeting of the wind. And in the absence of that friction, they didn't bind together as strongly, and so the trees cracked and fell over. And he uses it in the book to represent what's going on with our kids. If we don't allow our kids to have those knocks, then we don't allow them to build the resilience that they actually need in order to function in the world. So this is not a question of whether they know how to operate the washing machine or not. This is a question of whether they know how to deal with pain, disappointment, disillusionment, things not going according to plan. That's the question. So when a kid never falls out of a tree or off a slide or off a swing or whatever the case is, the physical body doesn't learn to build that resistance. It's like when everybody was running around with masks over the COVID period, and then they were picking up all these other ridiculous, the kids were picking up all these other ridiculous illnesses that they'd never had before because they had no exposure. Whereas you send your kid to school, the worst thing you want to do, particularly when they're really young, is send it to school with a mask. You want them exposed. You want them to have the germs. You want them to put the sand of the sandpit in their mouth. I mean, you don't really want them to, but you want the result of what it's going to do for them as they grow and as they become independent. So when we're speaking about independence over here, I think we have to distinguish between doing things for our kids versus protecting our kids from being themselves. That's really the challenge over here. Now, that's the one side of it, and I think it all resonates with us. Okay, wow, this is like a little bit concerning, because if we realize that we are not giving our children that resilience, maybe then, God forbid, when they go into the big world out there, maybe they're not going to do so well. So what's the alternative? Are we just going to let them go? No, you fall out the tree. It's good for you. Go climb that tree again. I mean, you've got to be realistic, right? It's all very nice in theory to say that if a child hurts themselves, it's good for the child, etc. But you don't want your child to hurt themselves. There's obviously got to be some kind of a balance over here, and there's got to be a responsible parenting. So what are we supposed to do? I don't know. Let's carry on. What else do you identify as where we're failing as parents? Because you were quite strong about it, right? That we're doing a terrible job. So
I think like those things we said before is about kind of keeping them safe and
Yes.
circumstances, as you say. But things like, I mean, you'll agree with me. At our schools, the minute something happens, it's like, okay, we'll phone the teacher or we'll phone the friend's mom. Or we problem solve for them, and they don't learn how to do
Correct.
it.
So we jump in to save them, right?
Yeah.
We jump in to save them a lot. So let's use an example. Let's use a specific example. So what kind of thing happens to our child that gets us into defense mode?
Or anything, like they get in the car and say, so and so was horrible to us. Or this,
Okay, there we go.
this
So and so
teacher-
was
this
horrible.
teacher
Right.
did this, and gone are the days where you say, well, listen to your teacher, and I like to think I don't, but most parents are like, well, I'm going to phone the teacher.
I'm gonna
and
phone the
gonna
teacher.
Sort this out.
That's right. Exactly.
So,
And by the way, that is a balance because you are your child's advocate. So if something is out of line, you do have to stand up for your child. The question is, how do you know if it's out of line? And maybe we are far too quick in today's world to say that it's out of line. I mean, I always think about how you see in the playground, these kids have a fight and they're literally ripping each other to pieces, and then the parents get involved. And then the kids get over it and they go play while the parents keep fighting and possibly never speak to each other again. So it's quite a balance, you know, to know how to get that right. What about things that our kids need done? So they need things that they've got to buy. They have projects that they've got to complete. Where does our role fit into that? Because I agree, we shouldn't go running in charging to save our children from disappointment or from the kid who hurt them, whatever. Like, we need to somehow give them the tools for resilience. Let's not use something as extreme as that. What about the fact that my child really, really, really wants X? What about the fact that my child is struggling with their homework, with their project that they're doing? Whatever. What's the balance there?
I can tell you what the challenge is. I don't know what the balance is.
Okay, what's the challenge?
I think the challenge is, sort of coming on to what you said, is that you don't necessarily want to be the parent who runs to the teacher first, and you don't necessarily, you know that it's wrong to be the parent who enables and does the project for the child and whatever. And it's the same as if your child wants something that everyone else has, you know that maybe you shouldn't get it for them, but then there's the balance of, but everyone else has it, and where do you draw that line of everyone else is getting someone else to do their project? Do you want your kid to be the one who's left behind, even though you know that that's
Just
the right
define left
approach?
behind.
Get the worst mark in the class.
Okay. Okay.
The only one that
Or the
comes
only
around
one
for the things
who-
like project.
Yeah,
Okay.
or the only one who
Good.
doesn't have the right shoes, or what? I mean, you could have.
No, these are good examples. These are very good examples. So I have to say, one of the advantages of being a Chabadnik is, and this is not a judgment, so please don't take this the wrong way, but by the time you get to like your 5th, 6th kid, these things don't bother you so much. You know, you take the bait for the 1st, the 2nd, maybe the 3rd. After a while, you start to realize, you know what, everybody will survive. You don't have to get so caught up with all the things that they claim to be the trends. And you also realize when kids use the expression everyone, it doesn't mean a thing. Everybody has this, everybody. So for example, we had the battle with more than one of our kids around phones. I think it's probably one of the most prevalent battles that we have. You know, and this is not a sheer about what's the appropriate age to get a phone, because that's very debatable, right? But we had this for a long time, and it was, but everybody else, right? Everybody else in my class has a phone. Everybody else has a phone. And my attitude was always, okay, that's a good thing to learn. It's a good thing to learn that you don't always have to have what everybody else has in order to be okay. It reached a point where it wasn't practical anymore, where the kids were making arrangements on WhatsApp groups and then your kid is now isolated. That's a different story. So that balance of falling into the trap of believing that everybody else is doing something and you're going to be the person who's not doing it, that should never be the measure that we use for our decisions. You know, there's a really interesting halacha about a duck. Okay, so every time you want to think about parenting, just imagine a duck. Maybe we should come up with like a t-shirt or something, you know, like a parenting duck or something like that. So the halacha is, in order for a duck to be kosher, it has to be in good health, like any animal. In order for an animal or bird to be kosher, it has to be in good health. But the way you define if it's in good health is different from creature to creature. So how do you know if a duck is in good health, and therefore you could shecht it, it could be kosher, if it has the ability to swim against the current? If I cannot swim against the current, it's not kosher. It's a really good lesson. If I have an attitude or philosophy about my parenting, or for that matter, about any part of my life, that doesn't have the capacity to go upstream, to swim against the current, to do differently to what everybody else is doing, then in all likelihood, that philosophy is not kosher. And we get this from the very first person in Jewish history, not in world history, but in Jewish history, which is Abraham. What's Abraham's official name in the Torah? We call him Abraham Avinu, our father, right? But how's he referred to in the Torah? Anybody know? In the Torah, it's referred to as Avraham HaIvri. Now, you're going to immediately, I know that. The Hebrew. Problem is that Hebrew is not a good translation. In fact, it's not a translation at all. Hebrew is just the anglicized version of the word Ivri. In exactly the same way as Messiah is the anglicized version of the word Mashiach. It's not a translation. It doesn't tell us what it means. So what does Ivri mean? It means from the word Aver, which is one side. And the Rashi, who is the most simple commentator on the Torah, immediately says that the reason Abraham was called Ivri is because the whole world stood on one side of the equation in terms of their beliefs, and he stood on the opposite side. And that's what made him the first Jew. In other words, the foundation of being a Jewish person is the willingness and the courage to do what is unpopular, what goes against the grain. So one of the first things we have to think of when we're making decisions, whether they be about parenting, whether they be about our own things, because very often, look, we say our children have peer pressure. We have peer pressure outside of the parenting space. We live with a tremendous amount of peer pressure. And one of the most valuable things to remind ourselves is that the definition of being Jewish is to have the gumption to be able to go against the grain. But for the right reasons, not just because I'm sticking my, digging my heels in and saying, that's it, we're going to be different. It has to have some basis. It has to make sense. So that's why I come back to the question, what is our objective? What are we trying to do over here? We're talking at this point about where we think we're getting it wrong, or the society is getting it wrong. That's all fine and good. But you actually can't measure if you're getting something right or wrong until you know what you're supposed to achieve. What is the goal? So what is the goal in terms of parenting? How do I know at the end of the story, whenever the end of the story is supposed to be? Because for some people you believe that it's after your kids graduate school, and for some people you believe it's once your child gets married, and some of us realize it never ends. But the point is, how do I know that I've done this right? Like, what is my child supposed to look like? Let me explain in very, very simple terms. Let's say that you're going to bake a cake, right? Do you have an idea what the cake is supposed to look like if it comes out right? Yeah, you know what it's supposed to look like. It's not supposed to be burnt. It's not supposed to flop. It's right. It's supposed to be fluffy. It's supposed to be this flavor. It's supposed to be this color. Maybe you're going to decorate it. You know what it's supposed to look like. Well, if you know what it's supposed to look like, then you can identify the ingredients that go into making the cake and the method that you're going to use with those ingredients in order to produce that cake. So what is the child supposed to look like on the so-called other end? What's a child supposed to look like? What does a healthy child look like? What does the product of successful parenting look like? We spoke about this a bit last time, right? What's the product? So here we're talking about what a healthy, independent child. What is healthy, independent? What does that mean? What is a healthy, independent child? Let me refine the question. Does a healthy, independent child phone you as an adult for guidance and advice on everything? Does a healthy, independent child as an adult never phone you for advice or guidance on anything? Or does a healthy, independent child make decisions but value your advice and guidance? I think it's fairly obvious, right? How do I get there? How do I get there? I don't want a child who can't make a move without consulting. And I don't want a child who never consults, who's kind of on their own mission. How do I get to that place where the child feels that there was enough love and attachment and independence that they could have that well-balanced relationship with us in the long term? So if they don't feel the love and attachment, they're going to go off on their own thing. And, I was neglected by my parents. I owe them nothing. I mean, God forbid our kids should ever speak this way. But that's it. I'm my own person now. And if there's too much overbearing love and attachment, then my child feels that they don't have the security to be able to make decisions on their own. So how do I find that healthy balance? How do I get them into a place where they value my judgment, they share their life with me, but they can stand on their own 2 feet? That's the cake we want to bake, right? That's the result that we want to achieve. So what are the keys? What are the ingredients? I don't know. Do you have any suggestions? Joy, you have the most experience, so you can...
I don't know, in the world that we live in today, it's not easy.
It's not easy, right?
Young
It's
adults-
far from easy.
Yeah.
And I think what you've just said is so important, because when you compare the world we're living in to other periods in history, while it's important to acknowledge the differences and the challenges that we face, it's probably equally important to realize that some things are timeless. And if we're going to invest all of our energy and attention in trying to address the things that are unique to our generation and not spend time on the things that are timeless, then we might get it wrong because these things are unique and nobody's got much experience about them, and we'll lose the opportunity of calling on those timeless lessons. So I think you have to be eyes open, aware of the world in which we live and the challenges it brings, and not define everything by that world. That's really, really important.
I think ChatGPT can replace parents at a point.
So is this your fear, or do you think we're already there?
Whoa. My kids are not adults, and I think they're pretty much almost there.
I know
Being
somebody.
adults.
I know somebody who is absolutely convinced that he has built enough information in his engagement with ChatGPT that he can now use it as his therapist. And just consider how dangerous that could be.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So I think the only time that ChatGPT would ever challenge us as parents is if we are not investing the emotional side that it can't give. Because from an information perspective, it could probably give better information and possibly sometimes even better advice than we could give. But if there's not that attachment, that's why I keep coming back to this, that there has to be that sense of love and attachment, then they won't be able to, they won't see the need in having our guidance. Because we all know that there's a lot of science around attachment. And if you have secure attachment to a parent, particularly in your formative years, then you can stand on your own 2 feet. So we understand that concept, at least in theory. But the question is, what does that actually look like? So that's why I wanted to tell you a story about angels. Not because angels know anything about parenting, and not because the angels in this particular story had anything to do with parenting, but because the template of this story is exactly one of those stories in the Torah that when you read it, you are 99% chance going to just say, oh, I know the story, and move on. Whereas the Torah never tells us a story just to entertain us with a story. The Torah tells us the story because there is value and wisdom in that story that's going to be applicable in our lives. And we obviously timed it this way, but the story is in this week's parasha, so you even have something you can share at the table on Shabbos. You get a lot of value out of this. Okay, so what's the first story in this week's parasha? This is not a test, but just checking if anybody knows what the first story of this week's parasha is. Okay?
Jacob,
So that Yaakov what?
that he puts the stones around his head. And
Okay, even before that. Even before he puts the stones around his head. Because you're getting to the angel part, which is correct. Yaakov leaves home. If you think about it, this is really the first story that we have of a person who grew up in a healthy household and then had to leave home. Because we've got Abraham leaving home, but that wasn't a healthy household. That was a place where his own father was willing to kill him because they had different divergent beliefs. They were like Republicans and Democrats. They'll kill each other in their own family sometimes. But Yaakov had a healthy family life. He lived first he had a good relationship, obviously, with his parents. And he lived in a home where there were good values. And now he's got to step out into the world. So this is a good test case for how do you give your child the wherewithal and the independence to be able to step out into the world and to make a success of that story. Okay? So, so now he goes out, right? Tammy, so what happens? He goes out and...
he's running away.
No, you started saying about the angels.
Oh, that he put the stones around his head.
So he lies down to go to sleep and puts stones around his head and he has a dream. And in the dream, there's a ladder. And on the ladder, there are angels. Probably one of the most famous symbols in the whole Torah is the ladder in Yaakov's dream. Now, the angels who climb the ladder and the angels who descend the ladder. And there's something about that story that captures the imagination of every single commentator on the Torah because it doesn't make sense. So what is that? There's angels going up and down a ladder. Okay, besides the fact that you don't imagine that angels need a ladder because they have wings. But there's something about how they climb this ladder that is very unusual. And every single commentator picks up on it. You know what it is? So the Torah tells us the angels were oilim v'yordim. They were going up the ladder, and then they were coming down the ladder. And so all the commentaries want to say, hang on a second, why on earth are the angels first going up the ladder? Don't angels originate in heaven? Logically, if you've got a ladder that goes from earth to heaven, and it's a ladder for angels, you would expect the angels first to come down the ladder from the heaven, and then whenever they've done whatever they had to do, then they'll go up. Why are the angels first going up the ladder? Now, all the commentaries offer various explanations, but Rashi's explanation is this. Yaakov is about to leave Israel for the first time in his life. He's going to leave Israel. And there are angels that accompany him to the border, and then they leave. Because they're not allowed to leave Israel. These angels are not allowed to leave Israel. So when he gets to the border, these angels have to go up the ladder. And now there are new angels that have to come from heaven that will accompany him in his journeys beyond the borders of Israel. So that's why the angels are first going up, and then they're coming down. Okay? Where does Yaakov land up going? So he's left Israel, which is this very healthy environment, this embrace of his parents' home. Where does he land up going? To a place called Haran. Now, in the Torah, if a place has a name in the Torah, that name captures the essence of what that place is all about. And the word Haran is related to the word Charoin Af, which means anger. This is a place that is so bereft of spirituality and morality that it angers Hashem that such a place exists. So Yaakov is going from the holiest of the holy to literally the jungle, which is pretty much what we feel is happening to our kids anytime they're outside of our line of sight. That they've gone from the warm embrace of the nest out into the jungle. He's going to spend a lot of time out there. He's going to spend over 20 years in Haran. And during that time, he's going to have many challenges. Firstly, he doesn't know at any point his brother could rock up. His brother Esav, who wants to kill him. So he's always got that in the back of his mind. What happens if Esav tracks him down and he comes and he attacks him? Then he's got his father-in-law, who's also his uncle, Lavan, who's a completely dishonest individual. He is as rough as they come. And wherever Yaakov turns, he manages to cheat him. Even to the extent of putting the wrong woman under the chuppah. I mean, I think, as breach of trust goes, I think that is as bad as you could possibly get. And when you think about it, here is somebody, just imagine what kind of a human he is. Not only is he willing to give the wrong daughter to his future son-in-law, trying to cheat his son-in-law, what does that tell you about his attitude towards his daughters? I mean, who does that? Who in their right mind would ever do something like that to their own daughter? Stick her under the chuppah and say, you stand there and pretend you're his wife and deal with the fallout in the morning. I mean, he's a loose cannon. He's a bad guy, let's be honest. And then Yaakov has to work for him for years. And he works hard. At the end of the story, Yaakov testifies that he braced the heat of the day and the cold of the night, and he barely slept, and he was looking after the flocks on Lavan's behalf. And from Lavan's perspective, at the end of all of that, he wants to cheat him again. But Yaakov lands up having the upper hand, and he does this whole genetic mutation of the sheep, and all the weird sheep that Lavan says you could have suddenly become like the biggest amount of flocks, and he lands up with a huge amount of success and wealth. And he also builds a family, which is probably more important than anything else, because the fact that he was financially successful, even though he was out there in this wild west, that's one thing. But he establishes a family, and he does a better job of this than his parents did, and his grandparents. Because his grandparents landed up with a Yishmael, who was not a nice character. And his parents landed up with an Esav, who was not a nice character. And he, on the other hand, lands up with 12 boys who are all dedicated to morality, belief in God, all the good things that Judaism stands for. Yes, there was sibling rivalry, fine. But there was sibling rivalry between Esav and Yaakov as well, and Yishmael and Yitzchak. But in terms of beliefs, in terms of sharing the family values, he gets 12 out of 12. So Yaakov is this incredible success story. If you want to look at somebody who could stand on their own 2 feet, who has the capacity for independence, look at the story of Yaakov. But the story doesn't end there. At the end of the parasha, he comes heading back home. He's not going to get back home in this week's parasha, but he starts heading back home. And eventually what happens is that when he gets to the borders of Israel, we're told that he gets met again by a delegation of angels. Now, there's no ladder in this story, but he gets met again by a delegation of angels. And Rashi says, who are these angels now? Rashi says, they are the angels of Israel who have come to welcome him home. Power, right? I just have one technical question for you. I thought they're not allowed to leave Israel. At the beginning of the parasha, Rashi told us that the angels had to leave at that point as Yaakov was about to cross the border, because the angels of Israel are not permitted to leave Israel. And then at the end of the parasha, when Yaakov is on his way back home, he's not yet in Israel. He's not going to get to Israel until next week's parasha. And yet all these angels come to greet him. And Rashi points out that there are many, many more angels this time than there were the first time. What's happening here? Do they or don't they have rules about leaving Israel?
Sorry, they came to meet him before he came back to you.
Before he reached the border, right? They came to welcome him, to basically escort him back into Israel. Sounds like, the rules kind of change a little bit.
Maybe through the challenges he went through, he created angels to go through that.
Perfect. And that's a very powerful concept. But then those dafka should not have been Israel angels. They should have been Haran angels, because that would have been his achievement. I can even produce angels in Haran. And that's absolutely valid. But what are these angels all about? So let's go back a step. What do you think is the spiritual difference between living in Israel and living in Haran? Besides the fact that Israel is his family and Haran is the other side of the family, the dark side of the family. Besides that. But what do you think spiritually is the difference between living in Israel and living in Haran?
Probably got to work harder at keeping yourself on track.
Where?
In Haran.
In Haran, right? In Haran, you've got to work much harder. Much harder. That's the difference. That is the difference. By the way, that is one of the reasons why, unfortunately, you find sometimes that people make aliyah and then they become less observant, because they don't feel they have to work so hard. Because everybody's Jewish and everything's kosher. And that kind of feeds into this belief system that I just go with the flow. But remember, in order to be kosher, you have to go against the stream. So if you're just going with the flow, it's not necessarily good enough. So spiritually, what Israel represents is when you are given spirituality, and therefore in a broader sense, Israel represents when you are given guidance or where your needs are cared for. Haran represents where you're on your own and you have to work it out for yourself. So the Yaakov story is basically the story of being held, creating secure attachment, then being sent out into a challenging environment to assert your independence and pretty much see what you've learned. But then his story is you come back to the home. Now, we already identified that the ideal is you want to have the kind of child who, when they are independent, when they're living their own life, they still come back to the home space. They still want your insight and your guidance. They don't want you to run their life for them. They don't want you to make their decisions for them, but they want to come back to have that sense of connection, that sense of true north. So Yaakov emerges as a great template to understand how this is supposed to work. And it effectively goes like this. There are Israel angels, there are Haran angels, and then there are Israel angels again. Now, in the language of Jewish mysticism, we speak about what we call Isarusa Dile'ela and Isarusa Dile'sata. The word Isarusa means an awakening or an arousal. So there are two kinds of arousal. But in plainer English, there are two types of initiation of a process. There's Isarusa Dile'ela, where the initiation comes from above, And there's Isarusa Dilasato, where the initiation comes from below. In simple English, I as a parent default to Isarusa Dilaela, which means I want to take the initiative to care for my child. That's the default setting of a parent. That's how we raise our children. That's how we care for our children. That's how we protect our children. So by nature, we want to take the lead. Then there's Isarusa Dilasato. That is an initiation that comes from below. That is where our children, for whatever reason, they take the initiative. They start a process. And how much nachas do you get when that happens? It's amazing, right? It's amazing. When you see your child take initiative and stand up and not need you to handhold them, and they're actually making a mature decision, that is invaluable. Now, I'll never see that happen if I don't allow it, right? I'll never see that happen if I don't step back, become a little bit invisible. So the example that I always think of is when your child wants to take their first steps, the worst thing you could do is be visible. Because they need to actually take that step. And if you're there, you're most likely completely on edge. And children read those nonverbal communication, those nonverbal cues, like a book. So if I want my child to take that step, I actually need to disappear, essentially. Which means if I want my child to own up and take responsibility, I can't save them. It's the same kind of principle. So anytime that I want to have the Isarusa Dilasato, anytime that I want to have the child take initiative, I cannot be in that picture. My angels can't cross that border. My angels are the angels of Isarusa Dilaela. My angels are the angels of guidance, of hand-holding, of, I don't want to use the word mollycoddling because I don't have to mollycoddle. It doesn't have to be a negative thing. It's appropriate in context that these are my angels. But when the child steps into their space, my angels are not allowed there. They don't belong in that space.
Doesn't a lot of this also boil down to like trust in Hashem?
That is true.
For instance, like when when they get their license and they're driving on their own for the first time, and it's so scary as a parent to put your child on the road.
Right.
But you want to give them those wings, but you also have to just trust. Okay,
You have to
Hashem's
trust.
gonna watch
Absolutely.
them, they'll come home safely. Like a lot of this also does boil down to your trust in Hashem.
I agree with that.
Putting your children out there, giving them independence.
So I would say that speaks to a broader issue, which is our need for control versus trust in Hashem. So here we're talking about a very specific scenario of parenting. But what you're saying is absolutely valid even beyond this. Our need to control outcomes, control situations, is a reflection of a weakness in our faith in Hashem. So in the same way as once upon a time we got into a car for the first time and we thought we were absolutely fine, but truly our parents were falling to pieces. So now it's our turn to fall to pieces and our kids feel absolutely fine. And that is the cycle of life, and you have to trust it. You have to trust that Hashem has created that cycle of life. So it's a very valid point. Absolutely valid point.
Where do you trust the child?
Oh, so here's the question. Exactly. So that's the question. At what point do you trust? Exactly. At which point do you trust the child? It's a great question. So that's why it's very easy for us to say, my angels are not allowed to cross the border into their territory. But I have to firstly, there are two critical points I have to identify. I have to know, firstly, that I've provided those angels in my territory. And secondly, I have to know that the border I'm creating for them is appropriate. So those are two critical things. So I'll give you an example. I know a family, and their parenting style was that we don't impose anything on our children. They are independent beings, and they need to work it out for themselves. So we don't have any religious doctrine in our family. We don't have any rigid rules, and whatever the case is, the children, they must assert themselves, become the kind of people that they want to become, which unfortunately they did. Because that is not nurture, that is negligence. So the first thing we have to do is we have to provide the angels. At the end of the day, you can't expect a child to work things out. It's not fair. So it's our responsibility to create boundaries, to give guidance, to talk to them, to illustrate, particularly when we see things happening around us, to use those as opportunities to illustrate things to our kids and say, do you see that? What do you think about it? Have a conversation. And through that, create context of what our home system is, what our our belief system is, what our value system is, those are the angels that I give to my child. At some point, and it's not a singular point, because there are various types of independence at different times, right? So anybody knows the first time you take your child to school, you feel like you're offering them up on some kind of child slaughter altar. Here I am, and then nobody could care for my child in the way that I do, and the kid cries for 3 seconds, so we go to the car and we're like a basket case for the rest of the day. The kid's completely fine, like as if nothing happened. But from our perspective, we think the world has ended. So there are multiple moments of letting go. Multiple. It's not a singular moment in life of letting go. And the value of that is that we can course correct multiple times through the parenting journey. So if we realize, oh wow, this boundary I let go of too soon, then I'll be more circumspect about the next boundary. So let's say I gave in to the child and they got their phone because everybody had a phone. And then I realized afterwards not everybody had a phone, and maybe that wasn't the best decision. That's not something I can undo, but it gives me a clearer sense for the next time of how to ascertain healthy borders. But once I allow the child that space, once I've made the decision, and hopefully I've made the right decision, that comes back to faith in Hashem as well. I have to trust also that I'm not going to be perfect, but when I've done my due diligence and I believe that I've now given them that independence, then my angels can't cross into that space. If I'm giving them the independence, then they have to own that independence. And they have to feel the pain of what goes wrong if they got it wrong. And they have to feel the reward of what goes right if they've done it right. And when I allow that, again, not having shirked my responsibility, I've invested in my angels fully for as long as I could. And by the way, that period is not as long as we think. So for as long as I could, I really invested and gave and guided, and I was present and found teaching moments and connection moments, whatever the case. Now I give them their space, their choron. That's it. My angels have to now wait. And that's probably one of the most difficult periods in life, is where you've got to watch and you know that what they're about to do is going to be hurtful, disappointing, poor decisions, whatever, and to be able to sit back and just watch it play out. Of course, there's a safety net if it gets really out of hand, but just to let it play out. Like you didn't do your homework, you're going to have to actually feel the pain of not having done your homework, even though I'm not necessarily the biggest proponent of homework being the be-all and end-all of education, but you understand the principle, right? And you did this to your friend, and now your friend is upset at you. I'm happy to give you ideas of how to deal with it, but I'm not going to deal with it on your behalf. So that's where you create that healthy boundary. These angels can never leave Israel when the person's going on their journey. But the minute that child is coming back from that journey with a little bit of a success, so in Yaakov's case, he's got a massive success. But I don't have to wait for a massive success. The minute my child is coming back with a little bit of success, then I send my angels. Because now my angels are not going to save them. That I'm not allowed to do. I'm not allowed to send my angels outside of Israel to save them when they should be standing up for themselves. But to appreciate them and to give them the support for having made healthy decisions. Those angels have to be even bigger than the angels that I gave them in the first place. So in the language of Hasidus, we say this. We say that there are two types of Isarusa de La'ela. That means the initiative that comes from the higher, the person with greater resources, the more mature, the more learned, or in this case, the parent. The one kind of Isarusa de La'ela is the system hasn't started working yet. It's my responsibility to get the system working. Those are like the angels you have at the beginning. And really, the purpose of those angels is just to give the push. And to our children, we always have to give that push. You got to give the push. You need to go and make up with your friend. That's the push. Now it's their business to work out how to do that. Or to give the push to say, you have a test coming up, you need to carve out time. And even if that means that I've got to say, these are the rules of it. Or to give them the push that says, I really, 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 really want what somebody else has, and say, that's fine. What are you going to do to earn it? And that could either be that they have to do some work and make their own money, or it could be that they have to be responsible for a certain academic result or a certain amount of household chores or whatever the case is. And then they, so those are my angels that I would give initially. The other kind of Isarusa de La'ela, and this is a very profound thought, is the way that Hashem treats us. The way Hashem treats us is obviously He initiates every process because we couldn't do anything without Him. But then He waits for us to succeed. And once we succeed, what He gives us back in response to our success is exponential to what we deserve for what we did. And that's really how Hashem treats us. That's what we believe, right? We believe, for example, you give amount to tzedakah, you expect tenfold in return. You do something in this world, which is a physical act, and you expect a spiritual return that is for all eternity, for your neshama. We're supposed to do something similar with our kids. Because what often happens is, when they have those moments of success, when they've stood up on their own 2 feet, we kind of give them a very, glib, quick, well done, shkayach, you see, you could do it. That kind of thing. Whereas if our response is a whole new isarusa de la'ela, that means a whole new input, a whole new, and you could really, depending on the age of the child, obviously, we could really ramp this up and turn it into like a very big deal. Then you create the sense that, A, they can believe in themselves, that they can do these things because look how much endorsement I get from my parent. And B, it's valuable to have that relationship with my parent because my parent really has my back. My parent really believes in me. My parent really supports me. So if you had to put it together, essentially it works like this. We all have love of our children. That's a given. Then the early stages of parenting are to establish that secure attachment, that they know that we've got their back, that they know that we care about them, that we invest in them, etc. But the most profound form of attachment that we can give them is when we tell them, we know that you can go, again, age appropriately, stage appropriately, and work this out for you. Because when you do, we will be so behind you, we will be so with you, we'll be so invested in you, that they never get the sense of, we've now just been let go. And ultimately, that's, I think, really what we want to achieve with our kids, right? So there's a 3-step template. Step 1, guidance. Step 2, space. Step 3, genuine endorsement and support.